When did they start observing 3i Atlas? No one expected any sensation. The interstellar object seemed like just another strange traveler, hurtling through the solar system on its chaotic trajectory. But everything changed when several radio telescopes simultaneously detected a reflected pulse, which, according to tests, did not originate from Earth. Radio astronomers are accustomed to noise. Space is filled with natural interference, pulsars, plasma flares, and chaotic background signals. But this pulse was different. It had a structure similar to human speech, but so distorted, as if the original sound had passed through a layer of matter that shouldn't exist among cometary rocks. And the strangest thing is that this flash appeared precisely when the comet increased its own emission in the 50 to 60 megahertz range, something never previously observed from such objects. According to the logic of conventional physics, a comet cannot generate radio signals. At most, it can reflect weak radio waves emanating from the sun or random cosmic sources. But what the instruments detected was not a reflection, but something more complex. The wave had a delay inconsistent with passive reflection. The delay was too smooth, too mathematically precise, as if the comet were reusing the signal. Even more alarming was the fact that different observatories received identical pulses, but with microscopic phase shifts, which, as was later discovered, corresponded to the direction of rotation of the comet's nucleus. This was confirmed by the fact that the shape of the distortions followed the comet's own rotation period, approximately several hours. It appeared as if the object was not simply responding to the signal, but modifying it depending on its orientation in space. When specialists from the National Radio Astronomy Observatory attempted to superimpose the signal spectrum on a known frequency noise database, another anomaly was discovered. Elements resembling formant structures of human speech were visible within the radio packet. These are the very frequencies that shape the sound of consonants and vowels. Of course, no one officially stated this, but among the researchers, the feeling arose that the comet had transmitted something resembling a distorted echo of a phrase. Not words, not a sentence, but the structure of speech itself. But Earth hadn't sent any radio commands to Atlas, meaning the source must be external. Moreover, the frequencies on which the signal arrived coincided with the ranges used by ancient space radio interferometers to search for extragalactic sources. In parallel, checks were underway. They determined whether there were any nearby satellites capable of accidentally launching a test packet. They checked for reflections from the ionosphere. They compared it to the noise emitted by pulsars in the constellations Scutum and Sagittarius. Everything was in vain. The signal transmitted via the comet didn't match any known cosmic source. It was too structured, too organized, yet so deformed that its original form was impossible to determine. And here, for the first time, scientists began to discuss hypotheses that had previously been considered science fiction. That the object might be reflecting not random waves, but ones emanating from an unknown source in space. Atlas, in fact, seemed to act as a transit node, where the signal changed shape as it passed through its interior. The very fact of such behavior already disqualified the object from the category of ordinary comets. By all the laws of physics, an icy body with a sparse tail cannot function as a resonator. But repeating patterns resembling attempts to transmit information constantly appeared in the spectrograms. If considered as noise, they were too precise. If considered as a response, they were too independent. The situation becomes even stranger when the analysis reveals small amplitude bursts when the signal passes through again, as if something inside the comet amplifies the reflection according to its own logic. This is precisely what raised the question that still lingers in laboratories around the world. Why does something resembling a filter occur inside Atlas? How does the comet know which frequency range to isolate? And most importantly, if the signal truly doesn't originate from Earth, then who is sending it? These questions remain unanswered. But as the object approaches the orbital segment where the radio density increases, the signals become clearer. It would seem that this should be a coincidence, based on the natural properties of the tail plasma, but it is not. The structure repeats with clear periodicity, and it does not resemble any known resonance. Scientists are beginning to suspect that we are not observing random interference, but the beginning of an unknown mechanism, or properties of matter that have never been detected in comets before. And if this really is an echo of another signal passing through Atlas, then the most disturbing thing is something else. Why does part of the spectrum look so much like human speech if no one sent it? What happened next took the situation beyond the realm of ordinary scientific anomalies. After a night of the first recorded echo pulses, the observatories began synchronous observations, distributing the ranges among themselves to cover the entire spectrum from 30 Hz to several gigahertz. Typically, such wide monitoring grids are used to search for gamma-ray bursts or fast radio bursts similar to the famous FRBs. But for the first time in history, such a protocol was applied to a comet. And within the first few hours, it became clear that the object was behaving too strangely to be explained by nature alone. Each time the radio telescopes detected a new range of noise, the comet responded with a flare, as if adjusting and modulating the incoming frequencies. This was not a chaotic reflection, but behavior resembling a reaction. Steps began to appear in the radiograms, short intervals where the signal intensity sharply increased and then immediately dropped. This pattern is characteristic of sources attempting to create a stable wave, but encountering an unstable environment. However, no natural object is capable of trying hard. But Atlas behaved as if it were trying to find the right range, as if searching for resonance. Gradually, something more alarming began to emerge. According to frequency analysis, the signals emanating from the comet had an unusual internal synchronization. Peaks within the wave appeared with a constant delay. It was this property that radio engineers identified as the most alarming. While ordinary noise is chaotic, the pixel structure of the comet's spectrum was orderly, as if someone had used a multi-channel modulator inside it. In one section of the spectrum, they detected frequencies used in terrestrial aviation for old-fashioned navigation, although Earth was not transmitting any radio commands in that direction. Moreover, the pulses themselves were too dirty to belong to terrestrial transmitters. They were distorted so severely as if they had passed through a dense medium, then refracted, and then amplified. This effect can occur if a radio signal passes through an inhomogeneous structure that no one has yet been able to describe. Moreover, all these distortions retain the same temporal signature, a constant phase, which is never found in random reflections. This became the key argument. The comet does not reflect, it processes. When the laboratories began applying spectral compression to the human audio profile database, another anomaly emerged. Within the spectrum, fragments resembling the frequency pattern of vowels produced by normal human speech were repeated. While it was impossible to identify specific words, the mere presence of speech patterns emanating from an object of interstellar origin shocked even the most cool-headed researchers. The spectrogram clearly showed that some of the waves replicated the shape typical of biological sound sources, but in an almost metallic, synthetically distorted manner. It seemed as if the comet was somehow reproducing not the original voice, but a trace of it, distorted, as if recorded long ago and filtered through a layer of cosmic dust. Then experts considered the most exotic hypothesis. What if the comet isn't simply picking up signals from space, but is some kind of relay hub? A bridge between civilizations that used interstellar space as a communications ring millions of years ago? If so, then the echo we're currently receiving might be a reflex of a conversation not intended for us. But why is its translation occurring inside Atlas? Scientists have speculated that a structure resembling a crystalline lattice or porous matrix could exist within the nucleus, capable of amplifying and converting radio frequencies. This theory makes some sense if we consider the comet a rare interstellar object composed of substances not found in the solar system. However, a problem remains. No natural matter can create the phase synchronization observed in the signals. This requires either intelligence or a mechanism. The most frightening thing was that, upon repeated observations, the speech fragments began to change structure. One signal developed a distinct descending sound, reminiscent of a human sigh. Another contained 3 narrow frequency bands, reminiscent of the rhythm a person makes when trying to speak but lacking speech organs. And all this was happening inside a comet traveling at hundreds of millions of kilometers per hour. Radio engineers called these sounds impossible. Astronomers called them anomalous. But people who have spent their entire lives practicing science began using a word they had avoided for decades: artificial. But the oddities didn't end there. New data revealed that the comet responds not only to natural cosmic signals, but also to changes in terrestrial transmitters. When one laboratory decided to test the range by artificially reducing the power by a fraction of a percent, the comet's response changed similarly within minutes. It was as if it knew the change had occurred and was trying to adjust. But if an object can respond to wave adjustments, then we're no longer dealing with a comet. This raises a question that people are now afraid to formulate out loud. Is Atlas reflecting someone else's signal, or is it trying to speak itself? Once it became clear that Atlas was responding to our radio frequency experiments, our research reached a whole new level. Scientists began conducting a series of tests, sending short pulses into space, varying their duration, power, and shape, as if testing whether the comet could understand the difference. They expected chaotic reflections, or at least random noise that could be attributed to plasma properties or the influence of the solar wind. But instead, they encountered what would later be called the most terrifying series of observations in the history of radio astronomy. Literally every experiment was accompanied by a response. Not a direct one, of course. No one received the same signal back, as if there were a giant mirror in space. The response was different, slightly out of phase, slightly stretched or compressed, but always emphatically related to the original pulse. If the pulse was short, the response became longer. If the pulse was long, the comet returned a short modulation. If the power was increased, the response amplitude decreased. Such an inverse relationship is found only in systems that attempt to achieve stable resonance by reducing the energy of external influences to maintain internal balance. To put it simply, it seemed as if the object had leveled off the volume threshold, as if it was too loud for it, and it instinctively took a step back. At first it seemed like a curious quirk of solar-wind interaction, but then something happened that forever cast aside any hypotheses about the phenomenon's natural origin. A laboratory in Germany transmitted a pulse toward the comet containing a simple binary pattern, just alternating ones and zeros, a basic digital rhythm that, in theory, has no physical meaning in space. But the Atlas response contained a structure resembling this same rhythm, only altered. It wasn't an exact reflection, but a modification, in which scientists detected fragments resembling the frequency bands of human speech. This conclusion sounds crazy, but it was reached simultaneously by several independent observatories. Spectrograms from Italy and Chile showed identical spikes, narrow frequency bands that matched in location and intensity. One astrophysicist compared them to encrypted breathing. Another called them a structure resembling an attempt to replicate a sound. Most disturbingly, this attempt was clearly unsuccessful. As if something without vocal cords or a mouth was trying to copy a human pattern without understanding how it works. But then, something even stranger followed. In one experiment, a group in Holland decided to test how the comet would respond to pulses that mimicked human speech in its most simplified form. They sent a series of modulations based on the mid-frequency ranges of the human voice, without words, without meaning, just a series of vibrations. And in response, the comet emitted a signal that, according to acoustic analysts, contained a rhythm reminiscent of the structure of phrasal segmentation. These weren't words, but they were something that could be described as an attempt to break sound into phrases. If this were a normal reflection, there would be no rhythm. But it did, and it repeated itself several times. Moreover, each repetition featured subtle changes, suggesting adaptation, as if the object were trying out different variations to get closer to the original structure. This wasn't a chaotic reflection, but a learning process. What if the comet isn't simply relaying cosmic echoes? What if it's analyzing the signals it receives, attempting to create a universal communication template? This hypothesis divided the scientific community for the first time. Some declared it merely a coincidence, strange plasma behavior, distortions, interactions with the solar wind, and magnetic fields. But the other group, those who had seen the spectrograms with their own eyes, claimed it was too structured to be natural. One of them uttered a phrase that spread through closed chat rooms at research centers. If this is a natural phenomenon, then it behaves the same way as we would behave if we were trying to talk to someone we don't understand. And against the backdrop of all these events, one fact emerged that completely shattered previous notions about the comet. One day, the comet reflected a signal that didn't belong to Earth. It didn't belong to any known source in the universe. It looked like an echo of something ancient, faded, scarred by millions of years of travel. But it contained recognizable human patterns, the same ones we sent into space decades ago. But we didn't send these signals in the direction of Atlas. The comet heard them from somewhere else, and repeated them back to us. But the most terrifying thing was that one fragment contained something that experts described as a distorted human voice. So deformed that it was impossible to recognize, but so structured that it could not be called noise. And then a question arose that now sounds almost constantly in scientific circles. Is this an echo of an alien civilization? Or an echo of ourselves? Transmitted back through something that serves as an interstellar communication channel. The following weeks descended into chaos, a cross between a scientific race and a psychological thriller. Instrumentation complexes that had previously stood half empty and were used only for scheduled observations were now working around the clock. Radio telescopes around the world, from Arecibo to the Atacama Desert, were retuned to a narrow frequency range where Atlas-related anomalies had been detected. It seemed the world had finally woken up, though no one was prepared to understand what exactly they would hear. And the deeper scientists delved into analyzing the reflected signals, the more evidence emerged that the comet was acting not as an object, but as a device. And this device wasn't simply reflecting, it was selecting, changing, and reacting. One of the most disturbing experiments was conducted by a group in Australia. They sent a short, consistent pulse toward the comet, as simple as a nursery rhyme, deliberately designed so that even a natural object would easily distort it naturally. They expected the usual dissipation or attenuation, but the response was completely different. It arrived with a 5-second delay, and that in itself was odd. Natural reflections don't have a deliberate delay. The response contained a fragment no one expected, a number, a clear, recognizable numerical pattern. Not binary code, not a pulse sequence, but a numerical representation, a series of modulations that perfectly matched the golden ratio. It seemed intentional, as if Atlas was trying to say, I understand what you're doing. I'll respond in the same language, but at my level. This response became the first global sensation in scientific circles, but no one yet imagined what the next signal would be. For several days, Western stations recorded a slow, barely noticeable increase in activity. It was so weak that many attributed it to solar fluctuations. But when the data was compiled into a single map, it turned out that the change was clearly directional. The comet seemed to be turning toward Earth, changing the angle of its reflective activity precisely at the moments when we were conducting our next test broadcasts. What looked like a coincidence, upon detailed analysis, revealed the incredible, a correlation with a probability of over 97%. No natural object exhibits such predictability in its reactions. Debates erupted in scientific centers. Some said it was proof, others said it was a statistical illusion. But in reality, everyone understood that this was too precise, too consistent, to be simply a trick of physics. And then came the turning point. One of the stations decided to try an experiment that seemed too daring. They transmitted a human voice into space. Not words, not messages, but simple breathing, a recording of inhalation and exhalation, as free of noise as possible. They believed that if the comet truly responded to frequency patterns, it might be attempting to interpret not the structure of language, but the very concept of sound produced by a living organism. The answer didn't come immediately. The stations were about to declare the experiment a failure, when, a few minutes later, the equipment detected a faint response. And it wasn't just faint, it was eerily similar to human breathing, but altered, jagged, as if something were trying to imitate it, without knowing what form it should take. Acousticians described the signal as the hum of a living creature trying to reproduce something it has never heard directly. These recordings were kept from the general public for a long time, not because of secrecy, but because the very idea of a comet trying to imitate human breathing seemed insane. But then things got even scarier. The comet began responding to signals not only in the radio frequency range, but also in lower frequencies, where human speech becomes a fuzzy but recognizable set of vibrations. No one understood exactly what it was doing, but it seemed like it was trying to capture the shape of a voice. As if an object created by an unknown civilization was trying to understand the sound of living beings. And all this would have been simply a surprising, but harmless, anomaly, if not for the following discovery. During an experiment with multiple repetitions of pulses from Chile, scientists received a strange reflection that struck them as unusual. Only after digital cleaning did it turn out that the reflected signal contained a hidden frequency modulation that matched the spectrum of human voices to within 0.1%. It wasn't a voice. It was something distorted, fragmented. But something within this sound was so familiar that several lab workers literally felt a chill run down their spines. The recording didn't sound like noise or distortion. It sounded as if something were trying to speak human words, but didn't know them. As if it had no mouth, no vocal cords, but a structure that was trying to speak. A new hypothesis has emerged. Atlas may be a repeater, receiving signals from unknown regions of space, not just reflecting ours. This would explain why elements resembling human speech appear in the reflections. Perhaps someone long ago sent a signal that we never directly detected, but which this comet picked up, and is now returning it in a distorted form. This theory has been supported by several astronomers, who have stated that the energy distribution in the responses resembles not a reflection, but a reassembly, as if the object is repackaging the signals. And it was then that quiet, frightening questions began to emerge in the scientific community. If Atlas was reflecting alien signals, then who were they intended for? If it was learning to recognize human frequencies, then why? And most importantly, if this device was created millions of years ago, had it ever heard a human voice before? Or are we the first time it has encountered biological speech? The world, watching from the sidelines, knew nothing about it. But scientists already understood. Everything that was happening was too synchronous, too meaningful, too vivid to dismiss the comet as simply ice, gas, and dust flying through the void. And now, each new signal no longer seemed like an answer, but the beginning of a conversation we weren't yet ready to understand. Just when humanity had become accustomed to the idea that Atlas was reflecting radio signals we hadn't sent, something that would later be called the most alarming discovery in the history of radio observations emerged. One evening, a brief increase in radio noise occurred in North America, so weak that most stations missed it. However, the Green Bank Observatory recorded a 9-fold spike in modulation. Short, thin pulses, as if someone had switched from a whisper to attempting to form sentences. These pulses didn't correspond to solar interference, didn't match any known terrestrial sources, and didn't fit the familiar structure of ionization ripples. But that wasn't the most important thing. The spectrogram of these pulses clearly showed the same frequency form as human syllables, but stretched and distorted, as if they were being spoken by an entity completely unsuited to it. One of the first to notice the strangeness was a linguist who hadn't even worked in space. He was invited to the project because of his unique ability to analyze speech patterns. He said almost immediately, "This doesn't sound like a voice. This sounds like an attempt at a voice." This marked the beginning of a new phase of research, with dozens of phoneticians, coding, and biocyberneticists attempting to identify the patterns. They found intervals characteristic of respiratory pauses. They found frequencies matching human consonants. But the strangest thing was that the fragments sounded as if they had been assembled from terrestrial radio transmissions, as if an object in space had recorded thousands of terrestrial signals from different eras and was now trying to piece them together into a phrase whose meaning was beyond our comprehension. And the more deeply we analyzed the files, the stronger the sense became that the sound wasn't just a reflection. It had been processed. It had been altered in the same way digital filters or intelligent systems alter signals to emphasize patterns or highlight rhythms. In other words, Atlas doesn't simply throw the signal back. It passes through it, deconstructs it, and produces a new form, a function that only an artificial object could perform. Then, a question arose that many were afraid to voice. If Atlas truly processes signals, then it has an algorithm. And if it has an algorithm, then it has a system. And if it has a system, perhaps it learns. It was at this point that research went beyond conventional science. Committees began to discuss whether the comet was an autonomous archiver, collecting information not only on trajectories and particles, but also on the voices of the civilizations it encounters. If so, then perhaps its structure stores millions of voices of those who spoke before us, and those who disappeared long ago. At the same time, another strange phenomenon was discovered. Several stations reported that the reflected signals were arriving not with a delay corresponding to the distance between the Earth and the comet, but with a delay 0.3 seconds longer than expected in a perfect vacuum. At first, scientists blamed plasma distortions, but further analysis revealed that the delay was perfect, repeated in exactly 11 consecutive experiments, and did not change during any of the broadcasts. It looked as if Atlas was spending those 0.3 seconds processing the signal, like a computer that must perform an operation before outputting the result. This caused a sensation within closed conferences. This data was not shown to the outside world, because if the world had learned that an object on a solar trajectory was not simply reacting, but calculating, panic would have ensued. But the real shock was yet to come. During one late-night observation, when the airways were completely silent, radar picked up a single pulse resembling a human word. Initially, it was dismissed as a fluke, but after filtering, the faint, flickering spectrum became terrifyingly clear. The recording was blurry, as if through 1,000 layers of interference, as if played by a faulty speaker. But at the center, barely audible, lay a sound that was unmistakable. It was a whisper, a human whisper. And the most eerie thing was that it uttered a sound resembling the beginning of a word, but broken off. The phonetic structure resembled H or ha, as if someone were trying to say hi or hello, but couldn't finish. Scientists couldn't believe it. A voice sent by no one had been reflected from an object that shouldn't have such a function. And then a new theory emerged, instantly dividing the scientific community. Perhaps the comet isn't reflecting our signals. Perhaps it's reflecting the signals of those who sent it. And if so, then the whisper isn't a human voice. It's the voice of those who used human frequencies to maintain contact. If the civilization behind this object has been traveling between the stars for hundreds of thousands of years, it may have studied hundreds of voices from species we'll never see. And now it's trying to speak to us using our own language. But it doesn't yet know how to pronounce it. The most recent recorded anomaly was the culmination of the entire study. When additional tests were conducted with pulses of varying strengths, Atlas began returning not only distorted human speech, but also patterns resembling primitive emotion spectra. The amplitude changes in certain locations followed curves similar to patterns of human tension, calm, or surprise, the very markers used in psychoacoustics to recognize the emotional tone of speech. It looked as if the object was not only attempting to speak, but also attempting to understand the feelings of the speaker. It was unclear whether this was being done by the comet itself or by the system that created it. But if so, then for the first time in history, humanity had encountered something capable of interpreting emotions through pure physics. And now, scientists are faced with a question far more frightening than any before. If Atlas is copying other people's signals, attempting to speak, analyzing emotions, it can only mean one thing. It's preparing. For a conversation. For a response. For a meeting. The world doesn't yet know the full truth. But those who have seen the recordings are now certain. There will come a time when the object will stop imitating. And for the first time, it will speak on its own. What it will say, no one knows. But one thing is certain. The voice we hear will not be a reflection, but the true voice of someone who has been observing us for much longer than we can imagine.